Hi, this is Debbie, and today I've got a cute penguin scene from An Arctic Christmas set from Sam Says Stamp, and I'm going to be watercolouring. I'd already stamped the scene on some Arches cold pressed watercolour card when I decided to turn the video camera on. So you're jumping in with me here where I'd already stamped it in VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and as usual I use the MISTI stamping tool and I stamp it several times until I get a really nice solid black outline. And then I leave it to dry for a while or dry it off with a heat tool, because the VersaFine ink, one of the advantages of getting a really nice crisp image with the VersaFine ink is that it is quite wet, and so you want to make sure that that's fully dry before you start watercolouring. While I'm watercolouring, I thought I'd answer a couple of questions that I often get asked. One of the most common of those is what watercolours do I use? I'll leave a link in the YouTube description to a blog post I wrote on my watercolours, but basically I use a variety of different watercolours from different companies, and I keep them in a half pan palette. Some of the watercolours came as half pans already decanted into the half pans, and that's how I bought them. And for some of them I bought some empty half pans and I decanted the watercolour into those. And then I keep them in this big palette which has lots of lovely colours in it that I can pick from when I'm watercolouring. You don't have to buy expensive watercolours, you can certainly get really lovely watercolour results with some relatively inexpensive watercolours. However, if you're really enjoying watercolouring and are prepared to make the investment, then artist quality watercolours are the way to go. I've got a variety of different watercolour companies in my palette. I've got Daniel Smith and Schmincke, Winsor & Newton and Daler-Rowney. And I think the best watercolour for you might depend on where you actually live, because, for example, a European watercolour would be less expensive in Europe, and equally an American watercolour would come at a better price point in America. Another question I've had asked is which watercolour card to go for, whether it be hot pressed or cold pressed watercolour card, and some of that depends on your preference. Today I'm using cold pressed watercolour card, and you can see in the video the texture that this card has. The surface of the card has dips and valleys, and that brings with it a certain amount of texture. I tend to like that texture, but on occasion I use hot pressed watercolour card, and that tends to be because when I'm stamping I want to get a really clean impression, and that's easier on hot pressed watercolour card which has a smoother surface. So for example in this card I used hot pressed watercolour card. I'll leave a link in the YouTube description to the video that I did of the watercolouring of this flower. But basically, because the flower had quite delicate lines, I wanted to get a really good impression, and therefore I used the hot pressed watercolour card with a smoother surface. While we've been chatting, I've continued to watercolour this Arctic scene in my usual slightly indecisive way. And as an indecisive person, the way I like to watercolour is by adding lots of light layers and slowly building up the colour. And then I don't have to make that big jump in with deep dark colours straight away and then regret it. I can start with the light colours and then slowly build them up, and then maybe a little bit more colour and maybe a little bit more here and there. And I think this is partially a reflection of my character, that I am slightly indecisive, and therefore I like to see a slow, sure progress through the deepening of the colours until I get to a point that I'm happy. I'll play some music while I continue to watercolour, and then I'll be back when I start to add some pencil to the watercolour to add some details and some shadows. I'm going to finish off by drying the watercolour and then giving it a good splatter with some silver paint, adding a few more details, and then I'm going to call it done at that point. I've recently given my craft area a really good clear out, and I've bought some new furniture for the room, and I'm finding that I'm getting an awful lot more light coming in the room, which with the sunny weather we've been having in Scotland through this autumn has actually meant that I'm getting quite a few sun rays coming in, which I do apologise for. Don't get me wrong, I love sitting at my desk with the sun streaming in, however it does make videoing a little more tricky. But as we progress into the autumn and winter, I'm thinking that that perhaps won't be so much of a problem. I've been using some Faber-Castell polychromos to add some shadows and details, and I'm using the Faber-Castells rather than the Prismacolor for a change, just to see how they compare to one another. And I find that the polychromos, you can get a much sharper point on the pencil. They're slightly harder than the Prismacolor pencils are. And having a harder, sharper point to the pencil, I did find it easier to get into the smaller areas of the image to add the shadows and details. I added some highlights with a Signo white gel pen and then trimmed the panel down, and now I'm deciding where to put the sentiment from the Arctic Christmas set. I've mounted the sentiment onto the door of the Misty, and again using VersaFine Onyx black ink to stamp the sentiment, and again I did that several times until I got a really good black outline. And then talking of black outlines, I did actually outline a lot of the areas where I'd lost some of the detail because of colouring over with the pencils. You lose some of the sharpness of the black outlines, so I went over those with a black marker. Once I'd done that, I added foam adhesive to the back of the panel. I like to use lots of foam adhesive to make sure that the watercolour piece adheres strongly to the card base, and I'm using a top folding Neenah Desert Storm card base in the £100 weight, and I've scored and folded that and then added the panel on top. I turned the video camera off at this point, but I did go back in and add a little bit of Stickles glitter glue to a few of the stars and also some glossy accents to the baubles. I'll leave a link to the products that I've used in the YouTube description below, and I'll also leave a link to the coordinating blog post that goes with this video, along with a link to the watercolour post that I wrote and also the video of the watercoloured flowers. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. I think that's everything for today. I want to thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.